No, I'm happy to talk here. I'm happy to have any kind of questions. I do have an American heritage, and we have a different style. I've been trying to figure out what I want to present. Some of the ideas I'm going to present here are actually relatively well developed and published. Others are kind of brand new, and I'm still feeling them out, so I'd very much welcome any input that you have. I would like to start with a quiz, though, sort of just a question for you about why you think, despite scientific consensus on the alarming extent of climate change, we haven't been able to get more concerted action. Today, of course, President Obama, not Stephen Harper, but many other world leaders are at the UN talking about climate change as I speak. But why haven't we acted more? Is it because of alternative sources of energy are not feasible, not affordable? Is it because of the political resistance by big corporations or the lack of public support? There, of course, can be many other reasons, but I'm just wondering if you wouldn't mind picking one of those four. So who would vote for number A, letter A? Okay. B? Okay. C? And D. All right. Good. You're right. Oh, sorry. But I think there are clear views about a lot of these things. And I also think, in addition, I'm assuming everyone in the room accepts the scientific consensus on anthropogenic global warming. If not, Hadi can answer your questions later. But there's also consensus on a lot of other things. I would say that there's consensus, and you can feel free to challenge me on this, although some of them I'll simply dodge. But I should give them my overview first. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the grand challenge of climate mobilization, why it's been so hard, how we think about strategies for change. And I should say as a preface that my role, I've been a professor at UBC for 27 years, and 3 years ago, I flipped into a role where I'm also a out-of-the-closet advocate. So I actually helped found and I helped run an organization called UBC 350 that I'm happy to talk about at the end or any other things at the end. But I do come from this perspective of a climate activist, but a climate activist scholar who's trying to sort through things. Among the ideas that have emerged are what I just found this out yesterday, actually, my whole concept. Naomi Klein has a new book. I don't know whether you know this. But in a big chunk of her new book is this description of the idea of blockadia, and I'll talk about that. Basically, it's the idea that we need to say no to stuff. We need to say no to intense extractivism, and that's the emergent solution. I'm going to look at that and how it's been applied to oil sands. That's the work that I've done the most time on. But then I want to turn, and this is where I'd like your input more, is to look at what the challenges moving forward are with the strategy that's based on blocking infrastructure. This talk is designed to go to about 120 or maybe 125. There is time to talk between then and 150. If anyone wants to sit around and talk to me about how to get involved in the political process, if you want to move out of your scholar, student, professor hat and get more directly involved in the political process, I'd love to talk to you about that. But I think there is consensus that there's a crisis in climate change. There's also, I would argue, a strong consensus that the transition to energy is feasible and affordable. There are some technical challenges. There are some short-term affordability challenges, but I think there's a strong case that that statement is correct. But we are stuck, and we're stuck because the only way we can get to move into that situation is to get concerted action by government officials. Government officials are elected or appointed somehow. They're responsive to public opinion, especially in democracies. We need politicians to take action to raise energy prices. Politicians are loath to impose costs, and they're not going to do so unless they're subject to extraordinary public pressure. So one of the main themes that comes out of this and comes out of Naomi Klein's work as well is nothing is going to happen without a truly massive social movement. And that's what people are trying to generate. That's what 350.org and others were doing in New York City and other places around the globe this Sunday. But it seems to be the case. The question is whether it can actually work. Here's a funny little thing about the fact that our technical options are feasible. This is a piece from The Onion saying, you know, we're just here waiting, ready to go as soon as you guys start asking us to deliver them. Economic feasibility. In terms of the cost of action, this is the working group 3 from the IPCC. the summary number for the range of costs to foregone economic growth that you'd get from a scenario designed to stay within 2 degrees. It's 0.06% of economic growth you'd be giving up every year. Is that a lot or a little? Added up over time, it's trillions of dollars, but when you think of it in those terms, in terms of that annual increment, it seems ridiculous that we're not doing this. And there, economists kind of disagree on how to put this, but there is an increasing amount of literature out there that suggests that that number's relatively low. Other people have said it's 1 to 2% of GDP that we take a hit. There's actually a new study out saying that over a period of time we'll do much better if we address this when you include the cost of air pollution. So I do think that it's something that we can accept. It's not just because it costs a lot that we don't do it. It's because of other factors that are related really to psychology and to politics. And this is what I want to talk about mostly, is go through this list of 7 very challenging dilemmas that are faced and that essentially thwart climate action. The first and foremost is that it's a remarkably hard problem. And we'll go over, I'm sure you're all aware of that argument, and we can go with that in more detail. But in addition to that, the psychology of the human brain is particularly ill-equipped to address problems like that. And we have very powerful opposition from economic interests. That was that C option there for you. We have ideological resistance, which I'll argue is a bit different from that. A culture of consumerism, so there's something more than just our ideology. There's something that is inbred into our cultures that we need to think about. And the obstacles to organizing pressure to counteract those economic interests is also very important. And finally, even if you could figure all that stuff out, we have dysfunctional governing institutions. And we could talk about that both at the international level and at the national level. I do include some cartoons every once in a while if that seems too sad to try to cheer you up. So the problem structure is essentially several core elements. The first of which is the situation is uncertain in terms of the long-term impacts, and especially, I guess it's fair to say, the response of the climate and environmental systems to so much more carbon dioxide, and the response of the system if we significantly reduce carbon dioxide. The uncertainty we face contributes to paralyzing us, and that's the structure of the problem is directly connected to the psychological issues that I'll discuss shortly. An arguably bigger issue is the issue of spatial inconsistency, where the costs of mitigation are imposed locally, whether it's forcing you to pay the carbon tax, so you're paying more for a tank of gas or more for your heating bill, whether it's having to install a new pollution control device to clean up your system, or change your energy system from one that's based on relatively inexpensive coal to one that's based on more expensive renewables. But the benefits of that are felt globally. And so it's a classic free rider problem, and that free rider problem exists at the level of the individual, it exists at the level of firms, and it exists at the level of political jurisdictions, whether that's a province in Canada or across countries. And you can see, you just watch the news or read the newspaper tonight, and I'm sure you'll find examples of politicians talking about how challenging the UN climate issues are because of this spatial inconsistency. There's also temporal or time inconsistency, and that is that the costs of mitigation are in the short term. You pay the costs now, here and now, but the benefits of them, because of the lags in the climate system, are distant in the future. And this, by the way, this is a chart that comes out of William Nordhaus's The Climate Casino, which, if you're interested in climate economics and politics and technology, is probably the best single book that I've seen in terms of reviews a wide variety of things. But he looks at the net benefits at different time periods, and you can see that the costs end up getting imposed in the short term, and the benefits flow very substantially but much later. And that is an extremely challenging thing for any political system, especially given the way the human brain has evolved. So the bracing consequence of that problem structure is that actors pursuing their own short-term material interests will not act sufficiently to address the problem. And I guess from my own personal viewpoint, I'm an optimist by nature. I became a pessimist when the U.S. Senate failed to act on the Waxman-Markey bill that the House of Representatives passed in the U.S. That was 2010, and it just occurred to me that, we're screwed. And we're screwed exactly because of this, that we can't get out of the framework of thinking in short-term material interests, and if we do, there's no, you can't solve the problem. But I've become an optimist again, sort of, a guarded optimist. Okay, I'm not really. I am optimistic because I need to in order to remain sane. But it is a very challenging problem, and I think that this tragedy of the commons case really helps demonstrate that. How many of you got to see George Marshall last week or 2 weeks ago when he was here? It's a very interesting talk. Interesting, colorful guy. But he summarizes in this, it's a very easy to read book, a lot of the psychological literature that I know that many of you have read in the room, and there's many elements to the argument, but one way to think about it is the core three things that climate change is abstract and our brains are not. Our brains are incredibly specific. That climate change, that we're essentially optimists, and optimists breed wishful thinking. It's a human response to thinking that things are going to be better than they might be, is we choose to do wishful thinking, and then there's whatever you want to call it, myopia, short-termism, that we're much better at focusing on the near immediate term than anything long-term. And a couple of good quotes from famous people about the consequences of these, from Richard Dawkins: the only solution to the problem of sustainability is long-term foresight, and long-term foresight is something that Darwinian natural selection does not have. And Lasarewicz from Yale: you almost couldn't design a problem that is a worse fit for underlying psychology. And that's a very powerful and challenging result. And it feeds, I'm not saying that's, given the problem structure, they're kind of the same problem. You have a very difficult problem structure, you have a human brain that's not well suited for it, that's a huge problem. That could probably be enough to thwart any serious action if we didn't have 5 other problems that we have to talk about. The next one of those I want to discuss, the third problem, is economic opposition. Economic opposition comes from big business, I think, as it is a very important part of the thing, but I also want to argue that it comes from people like us. From big business, there's 2 ways that happens. One is the capitalist system in which we operate gives a so-called privileged position to business. The business sector is the only one that can fuel the things that politicians want by investing and hiring. They're able to provide jobs, and they're able to provide tax revenues that governments depend on. That means that governments are loath to do anything that undermines the confidence of business from investing. And a very good example of this, if you're paying any attention to the liquefied natural gas dispute within British Columbia, in a couple of weeks they'll announce the fiscal framework going forward, and the key thing there is exactly how to create a tax that's good enough so that it gives British Columbia back what we think we should get, but not so big that it scares investors away from thinking it's too expensive to operate here. So that's a classic example of the operation of the privileged position of business. In addition to that structural advantage, business lobbies and spends bazillions of dollars lobbying and trying to influence politicians. And that does matter a great deal. And we've seen that with corporations, especially obvious in the American system. It seems so porous to money and outside influence. But if you look at the relationship between, say, the Harper government in Canada and the oil industry, there's also a very strong relationship there. And it can also exist, by the way, even if you don't have privately owned enterprises. You have big state corporations like in China that own the oil resource, that you have the same sort of dynamic that could develop. But where we come in, or people like us, because we're not like this, but we are, is that we are resistant to having prices increased. And every time governments enact policies that try to pursue price increases, whether it's a tax increase or something else, people tend to rebel against it unless they can see some very, very tangible return that they get. And Roger Pelkey, who's a political scientist, kind of a cranky one, has this idea of the iron law of climate politics, which is that policies that restrict economic growth are doomed to fail because of this reaction. It's not just big business. It's also that average voters are resistant to things that hit them in the wallet. Good example is recently in BC. BC Hydro and our electricity rates are terribly underfunded, and we're going through a process of having to increase them. And the government has had to adopt rate increases that are about, I forget exactly what the percentage, but much lower than both BC Hydro and the BC Utilities Commission think are necessary. They have to intervene politically to basically pull down on what the price increases would be because of the concerns that there'll be a big voter backlash. Okay, the fourth big issue, if economics wasn't enough, there's also the ideological issue. There's something weird about climate politics that's turned from, it used to be just a conspiracy by big business to obfuscate science. But it's become something much bigger. It's become a calling card that distinguishes conservative people from liberal or progressive people. And this phenomenon is most apparent in the United States, but it exists other places as well. And it really is quite a monumental phenomenon, something that's worth talking about a bit. I actually tend to think, and then maybe you disagree with me, but the issue of whether or not people believe in global warming in their hearts is declining a little bit. I think more people are coming to accept the reality of it. It doesn't mean they're any more likely to actually act on it. But we can discuss that further if you want. The culture of consumerism is another issue. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this, and I'm not sure that this is, from my perspective, the most important of the issues. But we do have this thing where we feel a need to be in a consumer society. How many people have an iPhone 6? You don't have to tell us. But if you did, you just spent a lot of time on the weekend trying to figure out how to get that, right? It is something that we have defined as part of modernity, and it is a potential issue for our ability to extract ourselves from certain types of behavior that contribute to the climate crisis. And by the way, if you're interested more in that, there's a number of resources that you can look at for this. The Monbiot Reed stuff, he's got a very good piece on that. The new book by Naomi Klein has a huge section on this if you're interested in pursuing that. Sixth problem, and I'm trying to get through these quickly because it's not, I just want to talk about how hard it is before we get to thinking about solutions, because that's the much more interesting part, but is the structural disadvantage of the environmental movement in opposition to big business and fossil fuels. Because of the structure of the problem structure being as it is, with the free rider problems, the collective choice problems that exist, it's very hard for environmentalists to mobilize on the issue. It's hard for them to motivate people to act on such an abstract, uncertain, and faraway problem. And we are going to look at exactly what's been done to address that, but basically the same structure of the problem that gives an advantage to opponents of action, the fossil fuel industry, creates serious political disadvantages to proponents of action. And all this, when I say, when I'm trying to do, I'm moving through this quickly, the social science about climate now is pretty well settled. We have an extremely good, solid, pretty much consensus understanding of why we're not acting. I would say the only big difference is whether or not it's more the problem of the fact that average people don't care enough and aren't pressuring politicians, or whether big business is manipulating government. So the C and D, that's the only thing that people still disagree about. We have a pretty good understanding that it's a really incredibly hard problem and why. But to wrap this up, finally, we have picked particularly, or we've ended up and evolved particularly challenging institutions in terms of our ability to address the problem. If you look at, well, I have a slide on international, a slide on domestic. Internationally, we're using as our principal framework for governments to cooperate on this, the UN framework on conventional climate change, which requires consensus from all the countries that are members of the United Nations. You couldn't possibly imagine a more challenging decision-making structure. It can't work. And fortunately, I think the powers that be are beginning to realize it can't work and need to move to something else. And Obama basically announced that a couple weeks ago. He got a lot of flack for it. But if you plan to use the UN mechanism as your major negotiating point, it's not going to be successful. So that's, I would fair to say that's the view of a lot of political scientists who have studied the problem. Again, we could talk more about that if you disagree. Domestically, and I'm just looking at North America here, we have really particular weird problems. We have our own dysfunction. And the biggest dysfunction, I think, is caused by the fact that our governing institutions, like federalism or separation of powers in the United States, they essentially refract the preferences that people express in political values. And what happens in the United States is that means that the majority interest in acting on climate change, which there is, can't be acted on by the system because of its requirement for extraordinary majorities. You essentially need between 60 and 67% of the legislatures of the House of Representatives and the Senate to act in order for anything significant to happen. In Canada, we have a different kind of problem. We have a problem where a combination of our first past the post electoral system and the fact that we have multiple political parties at the federal level means that you can end up with a situation, it's not inevitable, but it's with the pattern we have now, end up with a situation now where a party that has less than 40% of the votes of the public can run the country for 4 years or much longer, okay, as it has. Now, that doesn't need to be a big problem if that party is in the center of the political spectrum, but if it's on one side or the other, it creates real disjunctures between the behavior and values of the government in power and what the majority of Canadians want. That's exactly the situation that exists now on environmental issues in Canada. Which leads us with this, this is, I think it's entitled Politicians Discussing Climate Change, but it's a sculpture in Berlin that I just absolutely love in terms of how well we're doing at the international level. So that's a summary of the problems. And I want to move to shift to talking about potential solutions. And this is where there's definitely no consensus and where I definitely would like your ideas, but I'm going to talk about the emergent pattern that we see. And we've been talking, for 20 years about this first strategy. We need to communicate science more effectively. I also think there's consensus that doesn't work. Many of us haven't read that consensus yet, but it definitely exists in the literature on motivations in psychology and policy that convincing people about the facts of the situation doesn't change their mind. You have to talk about their values, and we haven't quite figured out how to work through that yet. We also have policy solutions. We know that we should price carbon one way or another, and we probably need to have supplementary initiatives to invest in innovation, so research and development for things that aren't directly motivated by pricing carbon, but we also know that those things aren't going to happen without changing politicians' minds. And the only way to change politicians' minds is to influence, in a democracy at least, is to influence what voters think and how they plan to act. And that's where the next step comes. So a lot of what to focus on, and these things I think will resonate with all of you who have been observing energy politics and climate politics in Western North America for the last little while. But there's been all sorts of reframing strategies designed to overcome the combination of the problem structure and the psychological barrier. So we want to localize situations. It may really be about climate change, but we want to talk just about tankers. That's a strategy of the Dogwood Initiative, for example. We need to make allies with frontline communities, including First Nations, because they have rights that we don't. And when I'm saying we here, I'm talking from the perspective of a climate activist. We exaggerate threats. James Hansen, people say world's foremost climate scientist. But he's also become one of the world's foremost exaggerators, talking about the Keystone XL pipeline as being the fuse to the carbon bomb that will mean game over for the planet Earth. Very hyperbolic rhetoric when you're talking about one project, but again, it's designed to exaggerate threats, to alarm people, to motivate them. We try to concretize things, and rather than having things be abstract, like global climate change, we want to make it very specific, like the pipeline that's going to be going through the heartland of the United States in the case of Keystone XL, or the Great Bear Rainforest in the case of the Northern Gateway Pipeline. We want to make those threats seem more immediate by pouncing on examples of extreme weather and linking them to climate change. And also, we want to create villains. We want to, it's been said that in order to have a appropriate, properly mobilized and galvanized social movement, you need to have some kind of villain in the story. And that villain has become the fossil fuel industry, and that's really what the divestment campaign is trying to do. It's trying to stigmatize the fossil fuel industry and try to affect their bottom line by doing that. So those are examples of strategies for change based on some reframing, and I'll talk more about that shortly. But you can also reshape actors and institutions. You could develop a new diplomatic structure to get out of the UN, and that's one of the things that we're now trying to pursue, is getting the biggest emitters, say the 20 biggest emitters, to agree that's a much more manageable number, although there are still extraordinary disagreements between some of the major parties, than all the nations of the world. You can develop new electoral strategies. That's actually something that's very challenging to do, but among other things that is happening are really rich people are getting interested in this stuff. So Tom Steyer in the US, a billionaire, is starting to get directly involved in politics and trying to influence elections by spending his money. And we can also restructure actors and institutions to create veto points to reconfigure power relations. And a good example of that is doing everything you can to advance the rights of First Nations. And in BC, we have this new court case that was decided in June of 2014 involving the Silcotin First Nation in the Northern Interior that is, in fact, reshaping power relations and moving closer to giving First Nations a veto over significant projects when you have Aboriginal title declared. All of these things combined together, not all of them, I'm not going to talk about the diplomatic structures or some of the things, but a number of the elements have been combined into this emergent pattern of doing everything you can to block every new fossil fuel infrastructure project. And this is happening not just in BC or North America, but around the world. And Naomi Klein in a new book, and by the way, whatever you think of Naomi Klein, a lot of people dismiss her, and I dismiss part of what but 95% of what she writes is actually very interesting stuff, in my opinion, but she definitely does a great job coining new terms. This is her new term, blockadia. It's not a place, it's a pattern of essentially frontline local groups, and not traditional environmentalists, but shopkeepers, homeowners, and others who are concerned about things like the safety of their water and whether or not the pipeline behind them is going to blow up, that they band together and they essentially figure out ways to stop the new thing from happening. And you can see this with oil sands pipelines. You can see it with fracking. And the fracking has really been a revolution both in the energy system and a revolution in social movements, because it's brought so many different kinds of people into the anti-fossil fuel movement. And you can see it happening with mining as well, which is less directly related to the climate crisis, but something that Naomi Klein and others lump into the same kind of situation. So I want to look at, as a case study, of blockadia, market access to the oil sands by talking about two pipelines in particular. And those two pipelines are the Northern Gateway Pipeline, which goes from the Edmonton area to Kitimat, or is proposed to go there. And then the Keystone XL Pipeline, which is a long-running dispute that takes oil sands down through the Midwest to the Gulf Coast of the U.S. So trying to get to the Pacific Coast and trying to get to the Gulf Coast. And the framework that I develop in this paper, cited down here, is a political risk framework. And I want to focus on one part of this in this talk because it relates so directly to blockadia. So how risky a new infrastructure project like an oil sands pipeline is depends on the relative balance of power of the coalitions in favor of it and against it. That's just it's a trite statement, but what I try to do is unpack those by looking at what they're actually a function of. So institutional veto points are very important. So in the United States, you know who regulates pipelines in the United States? State governments. It's shocking. Even those that go between states, they're authorized by state governments. So for the Keystone XL pipeline to get authorized, it has to be approved by all the states along the border. Nebraska is saying, wait a minute, and that's causing a big change. In BC, does the province of British Columbia have a right to say no to the Northern Gateway Pipeline? We don't really know yet. Probably not, but maybe they're certainly acting like they do. So those are examples of veto points. Another big veto point in the US is court decisions, or say the decision of President Obama with respect to the Northern Gateway Pipeline. So they're institutional locations of authority that you have to pass through, and different projects have different numbers and challenges in how many veto points they have to get through. Do opposition groups have access to the veto points? So a good example of that is a veto point in Canada is the courts, because the courts can deauthorize projects, and First Nations have access to courts. That creates a very formidable potential veto point in the system. Whether the project can take advantage of existing infrastructure. So it's very interesting in BC, there's two major oil sands pipeline proposals, right? One is Northern Gateway, which goes across the northern interior to the coast, and it's all new land that has not been used for pipeline purposes, and there's no existing right-of-way. Whereas the Kinder Morgan expansion proposal, the one that comes down here to Burnaby, for most of the route there is already an existing right-of-way. That makes it much easier to do. Same with that Line 9 proposal that's in Ontario that's already been approved, because there was an existing pipeline that could simply be reversed. That makes it harder to block the project. The salience of place-based concentrated environmental risks. So climate risks are global, as we talked about before. Tanker risks or pipeline accident risks are local. Water quality risks that will come from something like fracking are local. If you don't have a local threat, it's very hard to mobilize people. Blockadia is based on the existence of local threats. And finally, the jurisdictional separation of risks and benefits. This is very important in the Northern Gateway case and in the Keystone XL case. So who benefits from having pipelines go through the territory and having an expanded oil sands industry? The oil sands industry does, the government of Alberta does, the people of Alberta who, that generates tax revenues for, the people involved in the sector do, but people along the line, people in Nebraska don't get any benefits out of the Keystone XL pipeline going through there, and people in British Columbia actually get remarkably few benefits from the Northern Gateway pipeline. And so that jurisdictional separation of costs and benefits creates very significant barriers if one of the parties can cause problems for the project through a veto point. Okay, so that's the basic framework, but what I wanted to focus on in particular is this one, the salience of place-based concentrated risks. I think that ends up being very powerful, and the question is, if you, first of all, that's motivated a lot of blockadia, but if you don't have that, if you somehow get rid of that or overcome that and your other barriers, can you make the case to block a project just on climate grounds? And that's a couple of examples we have give us a good example of how blockadia works and the challenges to that, and how we're going to learn about this once President Obama finally makes up his mind. But first, with the Northern Gateway pipeline, it's the situation after a long, long time of discussion, argument, review. It was approved by the Harper government in December with 209 conditions. It's being challenged in court by First Nations and environmentalists, and I don't think there'll be any shovels that hit the ground, as they say, until the First Nations challenges are resolved, which will take multiple years. And we're, in the short term, we're waiting for the Clark government to decide what its position is. And we're also waiting for Enbridge to decide what its position is. Enbridge is currently trying to satisfy the 209 conditions, but most importantly, they want to see if they can reverse the opposition of so many First Nations, because they get that if they don't fix the First Nations opposition problem, they're unlikely to succeed in having the thing successfully constructed and operating at any time. And this quotation from Will Horder, who really is, among the environmental community, probably the single most important architect of these campaigns, is very telling about the power of vetoes in infrastructure projects, where the Enbridge needs to get the entire 1,200 kilometers built. Will Horder and his friends only need to stop 1 inch. And that's a very, very powerful statement. With the Keystone XL pipeline, it's very interesting because right now it's stuck in Nebraska. Nebraska has always been the local problem for the Keystone XL pipeline, in part because originally it went through the Sand Hills region that has a very important aquifer, and there was a great deal of concern that a pipeline breach or leak would contaminate the aquifer and affect many people's drinking water and source of irrigation for their farms. So it was a huge local issue. So you know what the pipeline company did? They rerouted around the aquifer. After saying they couldn't do it, they did it. So that essentially eliminated one of the veto points. But when they made that decision, It was made in a particular way by the government of Nebraska, that was challenged in court, and a lower court in Nebraska ruled that it was inconsistent with the statute that told governments how they can regulate. So they basically are going to have to redo it, and that's holding up the process while we're waiting for the next stage of that court decision to happen. If it ends up getting approved by Nebraska, the only remaining approval required, the only remaining veto point is this guy. And what's very interesting to me about this case, and the reason I'm focusing on it, is because it's now the one, if we get rid of the Nebraska problem, there aren't really any more veto points, except Obama, and there aren't any more concentrated local risks. All we have left is climate change. And this is the standard that Obama laid out about whether or not he would approve the pipeline based on its climate concerns. We don't know what he actually thinks about the pipeline per se, but that's the standard he laid out. He's articulated that he's going to do it on the basis of climate, but we don't know whether the net effects of the pipeline will be considered significant enough for Obama to bring that rationale in to block it. We do know that the State Department, the last time we've heard from the government about it, the State Department Environmental Assessment said, don't worry about it. There is virtually no net effect. Because even if you don't build the Keystone XL pipeline, you can't stop the oil sands from getting to market. It'll come in trains, it'll come in boats, it'll fly in, it'll get there some way. Okay? And that is a very powerful argument that if Obama's going to figure out a way to say no, he's going to have to come up with a different construction, a different model to show that it does have an impact that can meet that standard. So I just want to bring those cases in and help try to get you to think about whether it's possible to actually make arguments about projects based on climate rationales that don't require local effects. And it's very, very hard. It's very, very hard for those reasons of problem structure and psychology that we talked about earlier. Blockade is the new thing. It's what the movement has decided to focus on. And if you look at a lot of the rhetoric around the People's Climate March, whether or not it was a New York one or the ones here in Vancouver, so much of it is about blocking infrastructure, empowering local communities to do so. It has very significant strategic risks that go along with it, though. What happens when place-based risks don't galvanize resistance? Okay, so if you take the Nebraska problem out of the picture and all you're left with is climate, is that going to be enough to pressure Obama to say no to the pipeline? The Northern Gateway pipeline is probably going to get defeated because people in British Columbia are too worried about tanker risks. And the same thing may happen with the Kinder Morgan pipeline. So what do you do if you're the oil sands industry? You turn around and build a pipeline to New Brunswick instead, where you don't put tankers on the Pacific coast. And so if you rely too much on certain kinds of arguments, you may end up not being able to address the problem. More importantly, though, and this is where I want to end with this set of thoughts, is that we don't just need to block new fossil fuel projects. We do desperately need to do that in order to transform the system. We need to build massive quantities of new infrastructure in order to provide the energy services that humanity needs. And we need to do it right away. The same authority, the same social movement, the same structures, and the same ideology that give local groups the authority to block nasty, dirty fossil fuel projects also give them the authority to block clean energy projects. That's the real challenge that we face. And just, I don't know how this will go over, but as an example of that, the environmental movement in BC and First Nation in BC are adamantly opposed to the Site C dam, a spectacularly beneficial clean energy project. Is that a controversial statement? I assume it is. But I want to use that. It's a very, very low carbon project. If you think we need to build more infrastructure, move to 100% wind, water, and solar future, you're going to need to be able to build big dams. The West Moberly First Nations are going to United Nations to try to stop Site C. That's how opposed they are. So it's a very important thing to think about. And maybe you don't want to think about a big dam, but think about a wind farm or a solar plant. Or think about especially a very large, long transmission line. We're going to dramatically need to intensify the transmission grid in order to create a smart grid to make renewables work. If you give local groups, whether it's First Nations or communities, the power to block things, then they're going to be blocking transmission lines as well as pipelines, unless you have some kind of a process, a governance structure that has people buy in a way that they're not now. It's quite clear that our governance structure in terms of fostering any kind of legitimacy over getting oil sands products to markets has failed miserably. As we move forward, it's not enough just to say no. We need to construct a planning process and a governance process that people can buy into, even if it ends up affecting their backyard. And among the many things you can think about as you pursue your next projects is whether or not you'd be interested in playing a role in helping to make that planning process a reality. What I'm interested in is trying to figure out what the elements of that are as we move forward. So that's all I wanted to say for you today, and I'm happy to take questions and then stay after to talk about politics if you'd like to. Yes? Both of those things are true, and I don't think there's any way inconsistent from what I was saying. So place-based risks are what motivate people. A lot of people pushing the anti-Northern Gateway agenda have been climate activists, but even when they are, they talk about tankers. And the local allies that they have, especially in the north along the route, are far more interested in the concerns with their local habitat than they are with the global climate, at least with respect to that project. And the Canadian style of acting with respect to environmental assessments is to have the project be about, in a very narrow-minded way, about the pipeline. So the fact that the pipeline enables oil sands expansion and enables an increase in the amount of fossil fuels to be consumed downstream is beyond the scope of both the Northern Gateway Pipeline environmental assessment and the Kinder Morgan one. And the Northern Gateway one survived, that got done. The Kinder Morgan one is actually being challenged in court by various people. Those challenges won't win, but it has been very contested. And I've actually been involved, as other people around here have, about trying to make a case in the media and politics that it's just crazy not to consider the greenhouse gas implications of upstream and downstream risks. And an important one good rationale for that is the American process, so the Keystone XL process, does consider those. It may not lead to a different outcome, but at least it incorporates them into the environmental assessment process. Yes, Sean.
Well, one question is one that gets to this. People like Gateway. Question is, as you or anybody else looked at historical analogs and demonstration pressures to bear, especially following that's always because of the treatment with the southern some of the practices the same. The second is risk one, which is if you believe that you need the private sector to be involved in transforming our energy system, what risk is there in this anti-capitalist rhetoric that's bound up in some of this? But it becomes a more general anti-capitalist rhetoric. And we're already seeing this activity here in Richmond, right? Where then there's a problem with, well, anybody's making money off energy. Back running this rhetoric, no problem with this. Who's going to play that role in the system?
Okay. Can I ask you first, so those are two very, so people have done a lot of thinking about previous social movements and how that, so civil rights movements, and the biggest one actually that people are finding the most useful to think about is slavery and the anti-slavery movement, because that in a way was the only one of these that had the same scale of economic structure and incentives wrapped up with it, that everyone who was part of the economic system during that era benefited in some way from slavery. But was the disarmament movement effective? So I don't know, but what is interesting, and I've been thinking about this based on this weekend, because actually it's, Naomi Klein and her brother Seth Klein, who runs CCPA here, were leading youth activists in Canada on nuclear disarmament. And the equivalent to the New York thing that happened on Sunday, which got between 310 and 400,000 people, depending on how you count it, got 1 million for the big disarmament one. So they were able to bring out a lot more people. And that's interesting. And for me, I think it's the threat that people see. The threat seems more immediate just because the world might blow up. That changed that. But it's interesting to think that that wasn't necessarily that much more effective just because they got all those people out. What the slavery case says, and to a certain extent the civil rights case, is the power of moral arguments over economic arguments. When people tried to make arguments about economics and civil rights, or especially slavery, it didn't work. It was only when they shifted to the moral arguments that were effective. And I actually think that's where that's part of the reframing that needs to be done, is people need to stop thinking about trying to make a case for material interests of any kind and start talking about morality, which kind of relates to your other question. Your other question is a bazillion-dollar question, whether or not we can solve the climate crisis without moving away from capitalism, or whether or not to end capitalism at the same time. Naomi Klein's book the subtitle is Capitalism versus the Climate. When I say I agree with 90 to 95% of what she says, I just don't believe that. Okay, I actually think, and this is a very ideological question. It's a reflection of my own values and how I was raised, and also but what I've learned over scholarship for multiple decades in political economy and various things, is I think you need the profit motive in order to be able to solve this problem. This problem is so big, and we need to change so dramatically in ways that reflect so much innovation, that if we don't have the dispersed profit motive of many entrepreneurs, we're not going to be able to solve the problem at the pace we need to. The challenge is, and where I'm not convinced, is why haven't we got there? Because all we need, according to everyone, all we need is an effective carbon price. And then you'll unleash the entrepreneurial energies of the capitalist system. But why aren't we there? And if we're not there because we have capitalism, that's a different kind of argument. And so what Naomi Klein actually says is she's confused, she says different kinds of things, but what I think she really means is unregulated capitalism is inconsistent with solving the climate crisis, or neoliberalism is inconsistent with solving the climate crisis. I don't think capitalism per se is inconsistent with it. I see your question, but there was one over here as well, and I'll come back to you, Hadi. Go ahead, please.
So a lot of talks about social movements and whether they're successful or whether they're failures are often teleological in nature, and it's a total social construct, right? Like the success is a social construct. Walter Benjamin, he talked about social movements in the 1920s, and he talked about the way that social movements often have a utopian aspect to them. They want to accomplish something, but even in their failure, these ideas kind of wander around, and then further along the way, the other social movements will redeem them as well. So he questioned whether or not a social movement could actually ever be a failure, because these ideas are always wandering around waiting to be redeemed by ghosts. And that's something that David Graeber also talks about as well, is occupy failure. Well, there was a lot of talk before that and after that, exactly. Right?
So,
but he says, what I'm trying to say is, maybe we need to engage more with these ideas of what constitutes a success and what constitutes
sure.
failure.
So I'll give you an example of what constitutes success for the climate movement is keeping global temperatures within 2 degrees C of pre-industrial levels. And maybe that's cheating because we really don't know exactly how to get that. So let's agree that we should be able to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to an extent and to a rate that the current models show us would lead to a 2 degree C.
My second point is Roberto Unger. He talks about institutional change being very He says the number one rule we should remember is these institutions are ours, we made them. We can understand society because we made society, right? And he argues that we've gone away from that in social movements. This is where I agree, in social movements and in academia, and most certainly in politics as well. So how do we overcome all of like this kind of like idea that like we need things like capitalism to survive? He says that's a false necessity. Like we need all of these to survive. How are we going to overcome this?
Exactly.
It's even, no,
I don't know. What am I proposing in particular?
yeah, how would you propose to overcome that?
Join my environmental group. No, I don't have a good answer to that. We need to change people's sense of responsibility to humanity and to future generations. And my own personal view, best way to do that is try to convince people that their lives are and their well-being are at risk, and especially their kids' lives and well-being are at risk, and that will internalize the moral issues that I think would motivate people more directly. That's not been very successful so far, and instead people are standing in the way of fossil fuel infrastructure, hoping that broader political change occurs soon. But I'm sorry, I should get a couple more questions because these are awfully big issues. Hadi, you wanted to?
I just was going to say that just like no one today is going to look at the slavery question and say, what was it, the cost? The question itself is meaningless. At the time at which we act for climate, the notion that we're having economic decline and consequences would not be that. It's an investment in changing our moral attitude towards other design. It's an investment and a cost. And just even though it's hard to do this, the direct cost to the economy pre-slavery of abolition of slavery was over 25% of the value added. I've never seen anybody estimate how much stabilization cost in the past.
Yes.
First of all, I say slavery analogy is an obvious one, thing that I've entered into one. But my question is, if this has to be made in a moral argument, and Christianity in the West is so predominant religion, is there a way that climate can be communicated to religious groups differently than to, say, non-religious groups?
It already is, and if you haven't seen it or been made aware of it, I would strongly recommend to you a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Righteous Mind. And what Haidt is a social psychologist who emphasizes the different value structures of conservatives and liberals, or conservatives and leftists. If you and you can't convince anyone with facts, you can only convince them by appealing to their values. And what a historical mistake of the environmental movement has been to talk to liberals and progressives and not knowing how to talk to people who are business-oriented or people who are religious. And it's a very different frame of mind. For example, you need to talk about, for religious people, issues about purity and issues about God's plan for the earth. And you can actually very effectively communicate climate in that way. I mean, we are messing with if you believe that God created the structure, we are messing with God's design. So there is a lot of thought that's gone around that, and I'd strongly recommend it. That book's not about climate, it's about the broader issue, but other people are trying to plug that stuff into the climate. Yes?
I'm going to talk about an argument that some people are making, I'm not entirely sure what it is.
Okay.
So you're focusing on fossil fuel carbon problems, maybe not the problem. Some people are arguing that focusing on institutions that there's a huge vested interest in not stopping fossil fuel related problems. And then maybe we can build more confidence by focusing on methane, black carbon, maybe deforestation related problems. And we can build confidence by making progress there and recast all the So I wonder what you think.
I think those are great ideas, and we have made progress on forests. What Brazil's done with deforestation is extraordinary and fills one with hope. the sort of black carbon methane issues have been a little more stubborn, and I think we need to plow forward with those. But we can't wait to address the fossil fuel problem to see success from those others, because we need to act 5 or 10 years ago, and certainly we need to act now. So I guess I think you need to continue working on fossil fuel stuff while doing those others as well. That may be beyond our capacity, but it's urgent. So Sarah, and then you. Go. No, that'd be it then. I need to do that research. Yes.
Just a comment, if people need to go to class and sort of sneak out, and then George is able to stay for another half hour.
Yep. So it is having a Green Party that has representation in Parliament really helps, and having a political culture that is open to science really helps, and not so reliant on the fossil fuel industry as exists in North America. Those are the short answers that I have.
Big hand for George before you go out.
So we'll wait to see whether people want to stick around. Thank you.
Hi, George. I really enjoyed your talk.
Are you here at IRS?
Yes, I am in the University, and I just want to